welcome. Tonight's story is about the Phoenicians, the small coastal people who, without armies or empires, changed the entire course of human civilization forever. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders relax. Close your eyes if you wish, and simply listen. Tonight we travel to the ancient shores of the Mediterranean, to a world of cedar forests and purple dye and ships that carried the future of humanity across waters that most people feared to cross. This is a calm journey, a slow one. There is no rush tonight. And if these stories bring you peace and help you rest, we would love for you to subscribe and turn on notifications so every new story finds its way to you. Leave us a comment or suggest a historical story you would like us to tell. Your voice shapes what we create next. Now, breathe and listen. There is a letter in this sentence, and in that letter, in the specific shape of it, the way it was designed to represent a single sound, the way it can be combined with other letters to build words and sentences and books and laws and love letters and scientific papers and everything else that human beings have ever written down. A gift given to the world approximately 3,000 years ago by a people who lived on a narrow strip of coastline along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. They did not call themselves Phoenicians. That name came from the Greeks, who called them Phoenikes, possibly from the Greek word for purple, phoinos, because these coastal people produced a dye of such extraordinary richness and depth of color that it became the most valuable luxury commodity in the ancient world. Purple, the color of royalty, the color that kings and emperors would pay fortunes to wear. The people themselves, and the ones who lived in the cities of Byblos and Sidon and Tyre, along the coast of what is now Lebanon, called their cities by their own names and thought of themselves as citizens of those cities rather than members of a unified nation. They were not an empire, they were not a kingdom, they had no single king, no unified army, no central government of any kind. And yet, they invented the alphabet that you are reading right now. The letters of this sentence descend in a direct and documented line from the marks that Phoenician merchants scratched onto clay and stone 3,000 years ago to record their transactions. They established trading colonies across the entire Mediterranean, from Cyprus to Sicily to Sardinia to Spain to the Atlantic coast of Morocco, creating the first truly global commercial network in human history, connecting civilizations that had never had direct contact with each other. They founded Carthage, a city that grew into an empire that came within a sword's breadth of destroying Rome and reshaping the entire trajectory of Western civilization. And they did all of this, all of it, without anyone paying much attention. Because the Phoenicians were not warriors, they were not builders of pyramids or temples on the scale of Egypt or Mesopotamia. They did not write epics or philosophical treatises. They did not leave behind the kinds of monuments that later civilizations found easy to marvel at. They left behind something more durable. They left behind the tools that everyone else used to build everything that came after. This is the story of the Phoenicians, the people the world forgot to remember, the people who invented the world we live in. To understand the Phoenicians, to understand why they became who they became, why they went where they went, why they built what they built, you must first stand on their shore and look at the landscape that surrounded them. The coast of what is now Lebanon is one of the most dramatically constrained pieces of inhabited land in the world. To the west, the Mediterranean Sea, vast, blue, ancient, stretching to horizons that seemed, to people standing on this shore 3,000 years ago, to extend forever. The sea was not a barrier here, it was a road, the only road really, the only direction in which movement was easy. To the east, the Lebanon mountains, not modest hills, real mountains. The peaks of the Mount Lebanon range rise to over 3,000 meters, their slopes in antiquity covered with the extraordinary cedar forests that were among the most valuable natural resources in the ancient Near East. The mountains were beautiful. They were also a wall that separated the narrow coastal strip from the interior of the continent, that made overland trade to the east difficult and military expansion in that direction essentially impossible for a small population without a large army. The coastal strip between the sea and the mountains was, in places, barely wide enough to build a city. The Phoenician cities, Byblos, the oldest, inhabited for more than 7,000 years, Sidon, the great commercial center, Tyre, the island city that became the most powerful of them all, were built on the narrow margin between the water and the rock, using every meter of available flat land, expanding into the sea itself when the land ran out. This geography was not a limitation, it was an education. It taught the Phoenicians, generation after generation, that the land could not sustain them, that the mountains behind them were a resource. The cedars were enormously valuable, traded to Egypt and Mesopotamia, and every other civilization that needed timber and had none of its own, but not a direction of expansion. That the sea in front of them was not a danger, but an opportunity. It taught them to build ships, not the rough coastal-hugging vessels of people who were afraid of deep water. Real ships, ocean-going vessels capable of carrying substantial cargoes across the open Mediterranean, designed to handle the weather of a sea that could turn violent without warning, and that offered no shelter for hundreds of miles at a stretch. The Phoenician ship, the galley in its various forms, evolved and refined across centuries of maritime experience, was the most sophisticated vessel in the ancient Mediterranean world. Deeper hulled than the warships of Greece, capable of carrying heavier loads, equipped with both sail and oar to handle varying wind conditions, steered by a system of rudder oars that allowed precise maneuvering in harbor. These ships were the foundation of everything. Without the ships, there was no trade. Without the trade, there was no Phoenicia. The sea was not what the Phoenicians faced. The sea was what they were. The cedar forests of Lebanon deserve particular attention because they shaped Phoenician history in ways that are easy to underestimate. Cedar of Lebanon, Cedrus libani, is one of the great trees of the ancient world. It grows slowly to enormous size, its wood extraordinarily dense and resistant to rot, its fragrance distinctive and lasting. In a region, the ancient Near East, where most of the great civilizations were built on river plains where large trees did not grow, Lebanese cedar was the premium building material. The timber that Egyptian pharaohs used for their most important construction projects. The wood that Mesopotamian kings specified for their palace beams. The material from which the legendary Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem was built, according to the biblical account, and the account specifically mentions that the cedar came from Tyre in a trade negotiated between King Solomon and the Phoenician king Hiram. The Phoenicians controlled these forests. They harvested the cedar, prepared the timber, and sold it to the civilizations that needed it and could not get it anywhere else. This gave them an economic leverage that transcended their small size and their absence of military power. You could not build a great palace without Phoenician cedar. You could not build a great ship without Phoenician timber. You needed the Phoenicians, and they knew it. This was the foundation of Phoenician commercial power, a combination of unique resources, the cedar, the purple dye, the maritime expertise, that made them indispensable to the great civilizations around them, even though those civilizations were individually far more powerful. Of all the Phoenician cities, Byblos is the oldest. Not old in the way that Rome is old or that Athens is old in a way that makes those cities seem recent. Byblos has been continuously inhabited for more than 7,000 years, with them making it one of the oldest continuously occupied cities in the world, a place where human beings have been building and living and trading since the Neolithic period, since before the invention of writing, since before the first cities of Mesopotamia rose from the river plains. Its modern name is Jebel in Lebanon. You can visit it today. You can walk among ruins that span 7,000 years of human occupation. Neolithic foundations beneath Bronze Age, temples beneath Persian walls, beneath Crusader castles, beneath the Ottoman buildings of the modern town. 7,000 years of layers compressed into a single promontory jutting into the Mediterranean. In the ancient world, Byblos was famous for two things above all others. The first was papyrus. Byblos was the primary port through which Egyptian papyrus, the writing material made from the papyrus plant that grew in the Nile Delta, was distributed to the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Greeks received their papyrus through Byblos, and they named their word for book, Byblos, after the city. From Byblos came the Greek word for the collection of books, to biblia, and from that eventually came the word Bible. The most widely read book in human history is named, indirectly, after a Lebanese port city. The second thing Byblos was famous for was more significant still. It was in Byblos, or in the Phoenician cultural world of which Byblos was a part, that the alphabet was born. The story of the alphabet is one of the most important stories in the history of human civilization, and it is told far less often than it deserves. Before the alphabet, writing was logographic or syllabic. Egyptian hieroglyphics used hundreds of different symbols, each representing a word or a sound cluster. Mesopotamian cuneiform used hundreds of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, each representing a syllable or a concept. Linear B, the writing system of the Mycenaean Greeks, used dozens of syllabic signs. All of these systems required years of study to master. All of them were the exclusive province of professional scribes, specialists who devoted their lives to learning the system and who served as the literacy gatekeepers of their societies. The Phoenician alphabet changed this completely. Instead of hundreds of symbols, it used 22 consonantal signs, each representing a single consonant sound. Learn these 22 signs, a task that could be accomplished in weeks rather than years. And you could write anything. Any word in any language that used these sounds. Any message, any record, any poem, any law. The Phoenician alphabet was a democratization of writing. It took a technology that had been the exclusive property of specialists and made it accessible to anyone willing to spend a few weeks learning it. The consequences were revolutionary. Merchants could keep their own records without hiring a scribe. Craftsmen could label their products. Ordinary people could send written messages to each other. the entire relationship between writing and society changed. Writing was no longer the tool of palace administrators and temple priests alone. It was a general human tool. The Phoenician alphabet did not emerge fully formed from nowhere. It developed over several centuries from earlier writing systems of the ancient Near East, particularly from the Proto-Sinaitic script that appears in the Sinai Peninsula in the 18th century BCE, which itself drew on Egyptian hieroglyphic traditions. The development was gradual, the work of anonymous scribes and merchants over generations, each refinement making the system slightly simpler and slightly more adaptable. By approximately 1050 BCE, the Phoenician alphabet was in essentially its final form, 22 consonantal signs written from right to left, capable of representing the Phoenician language and adaptable to other Semitic languages with minimal modification. The Greeks encountered this alphabet through their commercial contacts with the Phoenicians, contacts that were extensive and sustained throughout the early first millennium BCE. They adopted it, modified it to suit the specific phonological requirements of the Greek language, and in doing so, added something crucial: vowels. The Phoenician alphabet, like other Semitic scripts, represented only consonants. The vowels were understood from context. The Greeks, whose language depended more heavily on vowel distinctions than Phoenician did, took consonantal signs that had no equivalent in Greek and repurposed them as vowel signs. This produced the Greek alphabet, the first true alphabet in the modern sense, representing both consonants and vowels. From the Greek alphabet descended the Latin alphabet that English and most European languages use today. From the Phoenician alphabet also descended, through different routes, the Hebrew alphabet, the Aramaic alphabet, the Arabic alphabet, and, through further derivation, the scripts of India, of Ethiopia, of Central Asia. Virtually every alphabetic writing system in the world today, the systems used by the vast majority of the world's literate population, descends from the Phoenician alphabet. Every word you have ever written, every text message, every email, every note, every book you have ever read, every sign you have ever seen on a road or in a shop, every letter in every language that uses an alphabetic script, all of it traces back to those 22 consonantal signs developed by Phoenician merchants on the Lebanese coast 3,000 years ago. The Phoenicians invented the tool with which human civilization writes itself. There is a color that the ancient world considered almost sacred, not gold, not silver, not any of the colors that we might instinctively associate with wealth and power. Purple, specifically a particular shade of purple, a deep, rich, complex purple that held its color against fading, that became more vivid rather than less when exposed to sunlight, that could be applied to wool and linen and silk with a permanence that no other ancient dye could match. This color was called Tyrian purple, after the Phoenician city of Tyre, where it was produced in the greatest quantities. And it was the most expensive commodity by weight in the ancient Mediterranean world. More expensive than gold, more expensive than silver, more expensive than any spice or gem or exotic material that the trade routes of the ancient world carried. The source of this extraordinary color was neither a plant nor a mineral. It was a sea snail. Specifically, two species of sea snail, Murex brandaris and Murex trunculus, that lived in the rocky coastal waters of the eastern Mediterranean. These snails produced in a small gland in their body a substance that, when exposed to light and air and treated through a specific process, transformed into the distinctive purple dye. The process of making Tyrian purple was labor-intensive to a degree that is difficult to overstate. Each snail yielded only a tiny amount of the raw substance, a single drop, roughly. To produce enough dye to color a single garment required thousands of snails. The snails had to be collected by divers working the rocky coastal waters, cracked open, the relevant gland extracted, the substance processed through a series of steps involving specific temperatures and timing and exposure to light. The resulting liquid was applied to fabric and left in the sun, where it underwent a chemical transformation, moving through a series of color changes from yellow-green through blue to the final stable purple. The process took days. A mistake at any point could ruin the batch. The Phoenician purple dye industry was, by any measure, one of the most successful manufacturing operations of the ancient world. The coastal areas around Tyre and Sidon are still identifiable archaeologically by the enormous middens, ancient garbage heaps, crushed murex shells that accumulated over centuries of dye production. These shell middens are meters deep and hundreds of meters across. The smell of a working purple dye workshop, from historical descriptions, was almost unbearably foul. The rotting organic material of thousands of sea snails fermenting in vats was not a pleasant industrial process, but the color was worth it. The association of purple with royalty and power that persists to this day. The purple of royal robes, the purple of the Catholic cardinal's vestments, the purple associated with imperial authority from Rome to Byzantium to the modern era. All of this traces back to Phoenician Tyre. In Rome, only the emperor was permitted to wear clothing dyed entirely in Tyrian purple. Senators wore a purple stripe on their white togas. The gradations of purple permitted to different ranks of Roman society reflected the gradations of power with extraordinary precision. More purple meant more power, and the most purple meant absolute power. When the Roman historian recorded that Julius Caesar, after his victory in the Civil War, appeared in public in a purple toga, an assertion of imperial ambition so bold it may have contributed to the decision to assassinate him. He was describing something that every Roman in his audience would have understood immediately as a declaration of the most extreme political ambition. Purple was not a color in the ancient world. It was a statement. And the Phoenicians held the monopoly on making that statement possible. The dye industry was the economic foundation on which Phoenician commercial power was built. The wealth generated by purple dye funded the ships that carried Phoenician merchants across the Mediterranean. It funded the establishment of trading colonies from one end of the sea to the other. It funded the political relationships, the gifts to foreign rulers, the diplomatic marriages, the commercial treaties that kept Phoenician cities safe in a world of competing empires. A small drop of snail secretion, transformed by Phoenician skill into the most coveted color in the world, funded a civilization. Of all the Phoenician cities, Tyre was the greatest. Not because it was the oldest, Byblos was older by millennia, not because it was the largest, Sidon may have been comparable in population at various points in their histories, but because of what Tyre achieved in the circumstances it faced with the resources it had. Tyre, Sur in Arabic, Zor in Hebrew, meaning rock, was built on a small island approximately half a kilometer from the Lebanese coast. This location was its defining characteristic and its greatest strategic asset simultaneously. An island city cannot easily be attacked from land. Any army wishing to take Tyre had to either build a fleet capable of defeating Tyre's navy, which was the finest in the Mediterranean, or somehow bridge the gap between the mainland and the island. Both options were expensive, difficult, and dangerous. The result was that Tyre survived repeatedly situations that would have destroyed any inland city. The Assyrian Empire, the most feared military force of the ancient Near East in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, besieged Tyre multiple times. The Assyrian kings who built an empire that stretched from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, who destroyed cities that defied them with a thoroughness that left no stone on stone, who recorded their victories in reliefs of extraordinary graphic specificity. These kings could not take Tyre. They extracted tribute eventually. They established nominal sovereignty. But the city on its island rock, supplied by sea, with its navy protecting the water approaches, remained essentially undefeated for most of its history. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, the king who destroyed Jerusalem and carried the Jewish people into captivity, who built the legendary Hanging Gardens, besieged Tyre for 13 years. 13 years of siege by the most powerful army in the world. The city held. Ultimately, a negotiated settlement was reached. The terms, by most accounts, favorable enough to Tyre that it maintained its commercial operations and its political independence in all but name. The wealth and power of Tyre at its height, approximately the 10th through 7th centuries BCE, was extraordinary by the standards of the ancient world. The biblical text of Ezekiel, written in the 6th century BCE, contains an extended lament for Tyre that is also, incidentally, the most detailed description of Phoenician commerce that any ancient source provides. Ezekiel describes the merchant ships of Tyre, their cedar planks, their fir decks, their linen sails from Egypt, their oars of oak from Bashan. He describes the goods that Tyre traded: silver, iron, tin, lead from Tarshish, likely Spain, horses and mules from Asia Minor, ivory and ebony from Africa, emeralds and purple and embroidered cloth from Syria, wheat and honey and oil and balm from Judah and Israel, wine from Damascus, white wool from Arabia, spices and precious stones and gold from Yemen, textiles and carpets from Mesopotamia. This is not a description of a modest local trade. This is a description of a commercial network spanning the entire known world, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the Arabian Peninsula, from the forests of the Black Sea coast to the savannas of East Africa. Tyre sat at the center of this network. Its merchants facilitated transactions between civilizations that had no direct contact with each other. Its ships carried goods that no other ships could carry as far or as reliably. Its commercial relationships, cemented by decades and centuries of reliable dealing, of fair prices and kept contracts, were the invisible infrastructure of the ancient Mediterranean economy. The great king Hiram I of Tyre, who ruled in the 10th century BCE, roughly contemporary with the biblical kings David and Solomon, is described in the Old Testament as a close ally of both kings, providing cedar and craftsmen for the construction of the temple in Jerusalem in exchange for agricultural goods that the narrow Phoenician coastal strip could not produce in sufficient quantity. This relationship, the exchange of what each party had in surplus for what it lacked, was the essence of Phoenician commercial philosophy. Not conquest, not extraction, trade, mutual benefit, the creation of value through exchange, rather than through force. It was a philosophy that the world would not fully articulate until the modern era. The Phoenicians practiced it 3,000 years ago. Everything about the Phoenicians depended on their ships, not metaphorically, literally. Without ships, there was no purple dye industry because the murex shells had to be collected from coastal waters. Without ships, there was no cedar trade because the timber had to be transported by sea to the civilizations that needed it. Without ships, there were no trading colonies, no Carthage, no Gades, no Utica, no network of Phoenician presence across the Mediterranean. Without ships, the Phoenicians were simply a small population on a narrow coastal strip, hemmed in by mountains and sea, with no way to leverage their unique resources into the commercial power they actually achieved. The Phoenicians built the best ships in the ancient Mediterranean world. This is not merely a claim based on their commercial success, though the success itself is evidence. It is documented in the records of the civilizations that employed Phoenician sailors. The Egyptian pharaoh Necho II, in the late 7th century BCE, did not hire Egyptian sailors for his exploration of Africa. He hired Phoenicians. The Persian king Xerxes, assembling the fleet that would attempt to conquer Greece in 480 BCE, relied heavily on Phoenician ships and Phoenician sailors. The core of the Persian naval force was Phoenician, a fact that the Greek historian Herodotus records with the grudging respect of someone acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. The Phoenician trading vessel, the broad-beamed, deep-hulled merchant ship that carried cargo across the Mediterranean, was designed around the practical requirements of long-distance commercial voyaging. It needed to be stable enough to handle open water conditions far from any coast. It needed to be capacious enough to carry profitable loads of heavy goods, metal ingots, amphorae of wine and oil, bales of dyed cloth. It needed to be efficient enough under sail to make the voyages economically viable. A ship that spent too long at sea consumed too much food and water and represented too much capital tied up in transit. The Phoenician shipbuilders, working with the cedar and fir of the Lebanese mountains that were among the finest shipbuilding timbers in the world, produced vessels that met all of these requirements. The hull forms they developed, the rigging configurations they used, the anchoring and mooring systems they employed, all of these were the products of centuries of accumulated practical experience, refined through constant use in the most demanding maritime environment of the ancient world. The Phoenician warship was a different vessel, optimized for speed and maneuverability rather than cargo capacity. The characteristic Phoenician warship of the first millennium BCE was the birem, a galley with 2 banks of oars on each side, the oarsmen arranged to maximize the power that could be applied to the water. Later, the Phoenicians developed or adopted the trireme, 3 banks of oars, which became the dominant warship of the ancient Mediterranean for several centuries. The trireme, in its finest form, was among the most sophisticated mechanical achievements of the ancient world. A precision instrument of naval warfare requiring crews of extraordinary skill and conditioning to operate effectively. The Phoenician contribution to ancient naval technology was not simply the building of better ships, it was the development of an entire maritime culture, the training of sailors, the development of navigation techniques, the establishment of the knowledge of winds and currents and coasts and ports that made long-distance Mediterranean voyaging possible. Phoenician navigation is worth dwelling on specifically because it represents a genuine intellectual achievement that is easy to overlook. Navigation in the ancient world was not simple. In coastal waters, you could follow the coast, In open water, you needed other references. The Phoenicians developed over centuries of experience a sophisticated understanding of celestial navigation, the use of the stars to determine position and direction at sea. The Greek historian Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, attributes to the Phoenicians the navigational use of the pole star, the North Star, whose fixed position above the North Pole makes it invaluable for determining direction and latitude at night. Earlier, Mediterranean navigators had used the more prominent Ursa Major constellation for rough directional guidance. The Phoenicians, according to Strabo, identified the pole star as a more precise reference point and used it systematically. Whether this attribution is precisely accurate in its details, the general picture it conveys of Phoenician sailors as the most sophisticated navigators of the ancient Mediterranean is consistent with everything else we know about their maritime activity. The Phoenicians did not build an empire in the conventional sense. They did not send armies to conquer territory, did not install governors to administer subject populations, did not extract tribute from defeated peoples at sword point. What they built instead was a network of trading posts, way stations, and eventually full cities distributed across the length of the Mediterranean, from the Levantine coast in the east to the Atlantic coast of Spain and Morocco in the west, each one a node in the commercial system that connected the resources of one region to the markets of another. The establishment of this network began in the early 1st millennium BCE and extended across several centuries. The motivations were practical. As the Phoenician cities grew and their commercial ambitions expanded, they needed intermediate stopping points along the sea routes, places where ships could take on water and provisions, where merchants could store goods between transactions, where Phoenician communities could establish themselves in new markets. The earliest Phoenician presence in the Western Mediterranean appears in Cyprus, the large island just off the Lebanese coast that had been in contact with the Phoenician cities since the Bronze Age. Cyprus had copper, enormous quantities of it, the metal that gave the island its name. Copper in Latin is cuprum, from Kypros, Cyprus. The Phoenicians had the commercial networks to sell Cypriot copper across the Mediterranean. The relationship was natural and ancient. From Cyprus, the Phoenician network extended westward to the islands of the central Mediterranean, to the coasts of North Africa, to the Iberian Peninsula. Sicily received Phoenician trading settlements at its western end, at Motia, on a small island off the western coast, at Panormus, modern Palermo, at Soluntum. These were not large cities initially, they were ports, places where Phoenician merchants could stop, trade, and continue. Sardinia had rich mineral resources in silver, lead, iron, and the Phoenicians established a presence there. Malta became a Phoenician trading station. The islands of the Western Mediterranean were, in effect, the stepping stones of a route that extended from the Levantine coast to the far western sea. North Africa was the site of the most significant Phoenician colonial establishment, a city that would, in time, become one of the greatest powers in the ancient world. The founding of Carthage is dated by ancient tradition to 814 BCE, though archaeological evidence suggests the actual foundation may have been somewhat later, perhaps around 750 BCE. The traditional account attributes the foundation to a Tyrian princess named Elissa, known to later tradition as Dido, who fled Tyre after her brother Pygmalion murdered her husband to seize his wealth, and who led a group of refugees across the sea to establish a new city on the North African coast. The site chosen for Carthage, peninsula projecting into a bay on the Tunisian coast near what is now the city of Tunis. All was extraordinarily well chosen. The peninsula provided natural harbours on both sides, easily defensible by walls across its narrow neck. The agricultural hinterland was fertile. The position on the North African coast gave access to the trade routes that crossed the Sahara from sub-Saharan Africa. Carthage grew. Slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, as its position in the Western Mediterranean trade network became more central and its commercial success funded expansion. By the 6th century BCE, Carthage had become the dominant Phoenician city in the Western Mediterranean, more powerful in commercial and military terms than the Eastern Phoenician cities that had founded it. It had established its own network of colonies and trading posts, had developed its own navy, had negotiated treaties with Rome, at that point still a relatively minor city-state, and with other Italian powers. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage controlled most of North Africa west of Egypt, most of Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and large parts of Spain. It was the dominant commercial and military power in the Western Mediterranean, the rival of Rome for control of the sea and the trade that moved across it. The story of Carthage and Rome, the 3 Punic Wars that ended with the total destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, is one of the great dramas of ancient history. It will have its own chapter later in this story. The Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal, was the western frontier of the Phoenician world, and it was extraordinarily valuable. The mountains of southern Spain contained silver, copper, tin, and gold in quantities that no other region accessible to Mediterranean trade could match. The Phoenicians reached the Iberian coast, navigating past the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, out into the Atlantic at some point in the early 1st millennium BCE. They established Gades, modern Cadiz, on a small island off the southwestern Spanish coast, in a location that provided access to both the Atlantic and the rich mineral deposits of the Iberian interior. Gades is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. It has been occupied without interruption for nearly 3,000 years. The silver of southern Spain, extracted from mines in the Sierra Morena and transported to Gades for shipment, flowed eastward through the Phoenician network to the markets of the Mediterranean. The quantities involved were enormous. Ancient sources describe the Phoenicians melting down their anchor stones and replacing them with silver during the return voyage from Spain, a detail that speaks to the extraordinary abundance of silver they were dealing with and the need to carry as much of it as possible. In approximately 600 BCE, something happened that, if true, represents one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of human exploration. A Phoenician fleet commissioned by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II sailed from the Red Sea southward along the eastern coast of Africa and kept going around the southern tip of the continent, around what we now call the Cape of Good Hope, though they had no name for it, and returned approximately 3 years later through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean. They had circumnavigated Africa. The source for this account is Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BCE, approximately 150 years after the supposed voyage. Herodotus himself seems somewhat skeptical about one detail of the account. He notes that the sailors reported that as they sailed around the southern tip of Africa, the sun was on their right hand, to the north of them. Herodotus found this implausible. We now know, of course, that this detail is precisely what you would expect of a voyage around the southern tip of Africa in the southern hemisphere. The sun would indeed be to the north. The detail that Herodotus found hardest to believe is the detail that most convincingly argues for the voyage's authenticity. The circumnavigation of Africa, if it occurred as described, would not be repeated by European sailors until Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, nearly 2,000 years later. This is the scale of Phoenician maritime achievement, 2,000 years ahead of the next people to accomplish the same feat. Whether the circumnavigation of Africa actually occurred is still debated by historians. The evidence is entirely the Herodotus account, without corroboration from other ancient sources or from archaeological evidence. It is possible that the voyage occurred exactly as described. It is possible that the account is a misremembering or embellishment of a real but less complete voyage. It is possible that it is entirely legendary. But the possibility that it happened, the fact that it is not physically impossible, that the Phoenicians had the ships and the skill and the motivation to attempt it, that the one detail Herodotus himself found implausible turns out to be exactly correct, means that the story cannot be simply dismissed. The Phoenicians were capable of it. That much is certain. What they actually did, how far beyond the Pillars of Hercules they actually traveled, what they found and recorded and brought back, is one of the great open questions of ancient maritime history. We know they went to Britain, or at least to the tin-producing regions of southwestern Britain, the Cassiterides or Tin Islands of ancient sources. Tin was essential for bronze production and was scarce in the Mediterranean world. The Cornish tin mines of southwestern England were among the primary sources of this critical metal. Phoenician merchants, or their Carthaginian successors, appear to have been reaching Cornwall by a route that carefully avoided sharing information with competitors. We know they went to West Africa. The Carthaginian admiral Hanno conducted an exploration of the West African coast. In approximately the 5th century BCE, his account, preserved in a later Greek translation, describing his fleet sailing past the Canary Islands and down the West African coast to a point where they encountered peoples and animals, including what appear to be gorillas, that could only be found in sub-Saharan Africa. How far they actually went, what they found, what they brought back, how they navigated in waters with different star positions, different currents, different winds from anything they had known in the Mediterranean. These questions remain open. The answers, if they exist, are in the silence of an ocean that keeps its secrets. The religious world of the Phoenicians was complex, and it is known to us imperfectly. Partly because the Phoenicians left relatively few religious texts compared to their Near Eastern neighbors, and partly because their religious practices were described primarily by outsiders whose accounts were shaped by their own cultural frameworks and their own reasons for presenting the Phoenicians in particular ways. The principal deities of the Phoenician world varied somewhat from city to city. Each major city had its own patron deity, its own specific religious character. But certain figures appeared across the Phoenician cultural world. Baal, the word means simply Lord or Master in Semitic languages, and it could refer to various deities, was among the most important divine figures in the Phoenician world. Baal was associated with storms, with rain, with the fertility that rain brought, with the power that controlled the sky. In a region where rainfall was the difference between agricultural success and failure, a god who controlled the weather was a god worth honoring. Astarte, the great goddess of love, war, and the sea, was one of the most widely honored deities in the Phoenician world, and through Phoenician commercial contacts, her worship spread across the Mediterranean. She was identified by the Greeks with Aphrodite and by the Romans with Venus. The planet Venus, the brightest object in the sky after the sun and moon, was associated with Astarte, and this association passed through the Greek and Roman traditions into the modern naming of the planet. Melkart, the patron god of Tyre, was perhaps the most specifically Phoenician of the great deities, without close parallel in other Near Eastern traditions. His name means something like King of the City, and he was the divine protector of Tyre and, by extension, of the Phoenician diaspora in general. When Phoenician merchants established trading colonies in the Western Mediterranean, they established temples to Melkart as their first act of civic foundation. The temple was the anchor of the Phoenician community, the physical expression of the connection between the new settlement and the home city. The famous temples of Hercules at Gades, described by ancient sources as among the most sacred sites in the Western Mediterranean, were temples of Melkart, whose identification with the Greek hero Heracles, Roman Hercules, was established by the Greeks themselves based on perceived similarities between the divine figures. The religious practice that has attracted the most attention from ancient sources and from modern commentators is the one that was most controversial in the ancient world itself, the question of child sacrifice. Ancient sources, Greek, Roman, and Hebrew, describe the Phoenicians and Carthaginians as practicing the sacrifice of children, particularly infants, in specific religious contexts. The biblical tradition is particularly emphatic on this point, describing the practice of passing children through the fire to the god Moloch or Molech with evident horror. The archaeological evidence is more complex and more contested. At Carthage, excavations have revealed a site known as the Tophet, a word that appears in the Hebrew Bible in connection with the child sacrifice practice, containing the cremated remains of infants and young children in ceramic urns, deposited over centuries. Similar deposits have been found at other Phoenician and Carthaginian sites. The interpretation of these deposits has been fiercely debated. One interpretation, the traditional one following the ancient textual sources, is that these were the remains of sacrificed children killed as offerings to the gods. An alternative interpretation developed by some archaeologists in recent decades is that the Tophet deposits represent the remains of children who died naturally, from disease, from premature birth, from the various causes of infant mortality that were extremely common in the ancient world, and who were buried in a special cemetery designated for children who died too young to receive adult burial rites. The debate continues. The truth may be that both interpretations are partially correct, that the Tophet deposits include both naturally deceased infants and the remains of ritual sacrifice in proportions that vary by period, and that the available evidence cannot precisely determine. What is clear is that the ancient literary tradition, whatever its exaggerations, was not describing a practice that was entirely imaginary. Something happened at the Tophet sites. What exactly that something was remains one of the genuinely open questions of Phoenician archaeology. Of all the legacies of Phoenician civilization, none is more dramatic or more tragic than Carthage, Founded by tradition in 814 BCE on the North African coast, Carthage grew from a trading post to a city to an empire over the course of 4 centuries, until it stood as the dominant commercial and military power in the Western Mediterranean, the peer and rival of Rome for control of the sea and the wealth that moved across it. The story of Carthage is the story of what Phoenician civilization could become when given room to grow, when the small coastal cities of the Levantine shore were not the model, but the inspiration for something larger. Carthage at its height, in the 3rd century BCE before the Punic Wars began, was a city of perhaps 400,000 people, one of the largest in the ancient world. Its harbours were among the most sophisticated port facilities anywhere. The famous Kothon, the circular military harbour, with its central island surrounded by 220 naval berths capable of housing the entire Carthaginian fleet, was described by ancient writers as a marvel of engineering. The city's commercial wealth funded a military capacity that few ancient states could match. Carthage maintained a professional army, mercenaries recruited from across the Mediterranean and African worlds, supplemented by levies from subject populations, and a navy of several hundred warships crewed by some of the most experienced sailors in the ancient world. The Carthaginian political system was, by the standards of the ancient world, relatively sophisticated. The city was governed by a combination of elected magistrates, the suffet, roughly equivalent to consuls in Roman terms, a powerful senate of wealthy citizens and various popular assemblies. The system was not democratic in the Athenian sense, but it was also not a monarchy. Power was distributed and balanced in ways that prevented any single individual from dominating indefinitely. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, discussed the Carthaginian constitution as one of the notable political systems of the ancient world, alongside those of Sparta and Crete, and found much to admire in it, particularly its mechanisms for preventing internal conflict between the rich and the poor. The conflict between Carthage and Rome, the 3 Punic Wars that consumed much of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE and ended with the total destruction of Carthage, is one of the most significant series of conflicts in the history of Western civilization. Not merely because of who won and who lost, because of how close the outcome came to being different. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, began over control of Sicily and ended with a Roman victory that forced Carthage to surrender the island and pay a massive indemnity. Carthage was hurt, but not broken. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, is the one that came closest to changing everything. Hannibal Barca, the greatest general the Carthaginian world produced and one of the greatest military commanders in the history of warfare, led an army from Spain across southern France and over the Alps into Italy, a feat of logistics and leadership that ancient and modern military historians still study with admiration and disbelief. In Italy, Hannibal won victories against Roman armies that were, by the standards of the ancient world, catastrophic. At Trebia, in 218 BCE, he destroyed a Roman army. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, he annihilated another, ambushing an entire Roman force on a narrow lakeshore in a fog, killing 15,000 men in a few hours. And then came Cannae in 216 BCE. Hannibal, with an army smaller than the Roman force facing him, executed a double envelopment, the encirclement maneuver that military theorists still regard as the paradigm of tactical genius. The Roman army of approximately 80,000 men was surrounded, compressed, and largely destroyed. Somewhere between 47,000 and 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon, one of the largest single-day military losses in the history of warfare. After Cannae, much of southern Italy defected to Hannibal. The Macedonian king Philip V allied himself with Carthage. The situation of Rome was genuinely desperate. There were serious discussions in the Roman Senate about abandoning the city and retreating to the colonies. Rome did not retreat. Rome rebuilt its armies, changed its strategy, avoided pitched battle with Hannibal while wearing down his supply lines and gradually reconquering the territories that had defected. The Roman general Scipio Africanus took the war to Spain, destroying Carthaginian power there, and then to Africa itself. Hannibal, recalled to defend Carthage, met Scipio at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE and lost, not because he was outgeneraled, though Scipio was a commander of the first rank, because the army he had was not the army he had brought to Italy. His veterans were gone. The forces he commanded at Zama were less experienced, less cohesive, less capable of the precise execution that his battle plans required. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were severe: loss of all overseas territories, surrender of its fleet, payment of a massive indemnity over 50 years. Carthage survived. It rebuilt. Within a generation it was prosperous again. So prosperous that the Roman senator Cato the Elder ended every speech he gave on any subject whatsoever with the same phrase: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Eventually, it was. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, was, in retrospect, a war of annihilation dressed in the language of provocation. Rome found a pretext, sent an army to North Africa, and after a 3-year siege during which the Carthaginians defended their city with desperate courage, broke through the walls, what followed was total. The city was burned, the survivors were enslaved, the site was demolished. Whether the Romans actually salted the earth, a later tradition of uncertain origin, or simply left it desolate, the result was the same. Carthage ceased to exist, a city of 400,000 people, one of the greatest commercial civilizations in the ancient world, obliterated in 146 BCE, leaving behind a name, some ruins, and a question that historians have pondered ever since. What if Hannibal had won at Zama? What if Rome had been forced to make peace on Carthaginian terms? What if the Western Mediterranean had remained under Carthaginian rather than Roman dominance? What language would Western Europe speak today? What gods would it worship? What laws would it follow? We will never know. The question hangs in the air, unanswerable, above the ruins of a city that no longer exists. While the political fate of the Phoenician cities played out in the drama of empires and wars, the most enduring Phoenician contribution to human civilization was spreading quietly through the world by an entirely different mechanism. The alphabet did not spread by conquest, it spread by contact. Every people who encountered Phoenician merchants, who saw the marks they scratched on clay and stone to record their transactions, who understood what those marks could do, eventually either adopted the Phoenician alphabet directly or developed their own writing system in response to the encounter with alphabetic writing, the Greeks were the most consequential adopters. The Greek adoption of the Phoenician alphabet, which the Greeks themselves acknowledged, calling their letters Phoenicia grammata, Phoenician letters, transformed Greek culture. Before the alphabet, Greek was a spoken language. The earlier Linear B script, the Mycenaean writing system that had been used in the Bronze Age, had collapsed along with Mycenaean civilization around 1200 BCE, leaving Greece in what is sometimes called the Greek Dark Ages, a period of several centuries during which literacy, such as it had been, largely disappeared. When the Phoenician alphabet arrived in Greece, probably in the 9th or 8th century BCE, through the commercial contacts that Phoenician merchants had with Greek communities across the Aegean, it arrived in a culture that was ready to use it. The Greeks adapted it quickly and used it to write everything. The Iliad and the Odyssey, the foundational texts of Western literary tradition, were probably written down in their current form in the 8th or 7th century BCE, in the immediate aftermath of the Greek adoption of alphabetic writing. They may have been composed earlier and preserved in oral tradition, but they were fixed and transmitted through the new alphabetic technology. The philosophical tradition of ancient Greece, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and all the rest, it was made possible by alphabetic writing. Philosophy requires the ability to examine arguments carefully, to return to previous positions and check their consistency, to build complex chains of reasoning that exceed the capacity of unaided memory. These things are possible only with writing. The legal tradition of ancient Greece, the written laws that replaced the unwritten customary traditions of the pre-literate period, that gave citizens fixed rights and defined obligations, required alphabetic writing. The written law that everyone could in principle read, that was not subject to the selective memory of those in power, was a fundamentally different institution from the unwritten custom that it replaced. All of these developments, the literary tradition, the philosophical tradition, the legal tradition, flowed in part from the Phoenician gift of the alphabet. From the Greek alphabet descended the Latin alphabet that the Romans adopted for their language and spread across their empire. The Latin alphabet in various modified forms is today used to write English, French, Spanish, German, Italian, Portuguese, Dutch, Polish, Swedish, and dozens of other languages, the primary script of most of Europe and of all the former European colonies across the Americas, Australia, and Africa. From the Phoenician alphabet also descended through the Aramaic branch the Hebrew alphabet that preserves the Torah and other foundational texts of Judaism, the Arabic alphabet that carries the Quran and the literary tradition of the Islamic world, the Syriac alphabet that was the vehicle of early Christian scholarship in the Middle East, the scripts of Ethiopia, of Central Asia, of India, all connecting back through chains of derivation to the 22 consonantal signs of the Phoenician merchants. The scope of this inheritance is almost impossible to fully appreciate. It encompasses virtually every written tradition in the world today. The words you are hearing right now, the English sentences that form this narrative, are written in characters that descend directly from Phoenician. Every word written in an alphabetic script anywhere on Earth carries, in the shape of its letters, the DNA of Phoenician merchant notation. The purple dye was the most famous Phoenician manufactured product. The alphabet was the most consequential Phoenician intellectual contribution. But there was a third gift, less famous than either, but in its own way, equally significant: glass. The Phoenicians did not invent glass. Glassmaking had been known in Egypt and Mesopotamia for centuries before the Phoenicians began producing it. But the Phoenicians transformed glass from an occasional expensive luxury into an accessible commodity and they did it through a combination of technical innovation and commercial genius. The ancient legend preserved by Pliny the Elder in his Natural History attributed the invention of glass to Phoenician merchants. According to Pliny, merchants transporting natron, a naturally occurring sodium carbonate used in various industrial and religious applications, stopped on a sandy beach and used lumps of natron to support their cooking pots over a fire. The heat caused the natron to fuse with the sand beneath it, and the result was a flow of liquid glass. This account is almost certainly legendary. The temperatures achievable by a cooking fire are far below those required to melt glass. But the persistence of the legend reflects a genuine historical truth. The Phoenicians were so associated with glass production and trade in the ancient world that they were remembered as its originators. What the Phoenicians actually did was develop and spread glassblowing, a revolutionary technique that transformed the economics of glass production. Before glassblowing, glass objects were made by laboriously building up layers of glass around a clay core, or by casting glass in molds, processes that were slow, expensive, and limited in the forms they could produce. Glassblowing, the technique of inflating a gather of molten glass on the end of a metal tube using breath to create a bubble that could then be shaped by skilled manipulation, was developed in the Phoenician/Syrian coastal region in approximately the 1st century BCE. It transformed glassmaking. A skilled glassblower could produce in minutes a vessel that would have taken hours to make by the earlier methods. The cost of glass objects dropped dramatically. The range of forms that could be produced expanded enormously. From the simple bubble of blown glass, a skilled practitioner could shape bowls, bottles, flasks, cups, and a seemingly endless variety of other forms. Glass moved from luxury to commodity, from the exclusive possession of the wealthy to an everyday material available to ordinary households. The glass bottle, the glass window, the glass lens, without which the scientific revolution of the 17th century would not have been possible, because neither the telescope nor the microscope can exist without optical glass. All of this traces back to the Phoenician coast, to the workshops near Sidon and Tyre, where glassblowing was developed and refined, and from which the technique spread across the Roman world. Sidon, in particular, became famous throughout the ancient Mediterranean world for the quality of its glasswork. Sidonian glass, a term that appears in ancient sources as a mark of quality, was the premium product of an industry that spread from the Phoenician coast across the Roman Empire. The glass vessels of Sidon have been found in archaeological contexts from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the Black Sea coast, the physical evidence of a trade network that carried Phoenician glasswork to every corner of the Roman world. A bottle of Sidonian glass, dug up from a Roman context in a British archaeological excavation, is a physical connection between the Romano-British world and the Phoenician craftsmen who blew the glass on the Lebanese coast, a thread of material culture stretching across 2,000 miles and 2,000 years. No account of the Phoenicians can avoid the Hebrew Bible, the collection of texts that is simultaneously the most important literary source for Phoenician history and one of the most complex interpretive challenges in the study of the ancient Near East. The Phoenicians appear throughout the Hebrew Bible, and their appearances reveal both the intimacy of the relationship between the Phoenician cities and the ancient Israelite and Judahite kingdoms, and the profound ambivalence with which the biblical authors regarded their neighbors. The most extended and positive portrayal of a Phoenician ruler in the biblical text is that of Hiram I of Tyre, the king who, according to both the books of Kings and Chronicles, was a close ally of both David and Solomon. Hiram provided the cedar and the craftsmen for the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, the most sacred building in ancient Israelite religion. The biblical text is specific about the arrangement. Solomon provided wheat and olive oil for Hiram's household in exchange for cedar and fir timber, and the specialized labor of Phoenician craftsmen. The exchange was commercial, a trade agreement between sovereign rulers, but the biblical narrative frames it in terms of personal friendship and mutual respect. Hiram, in this portrayal, is not simply a business partner. He is a friend, someone who loved David, 1 Kings 5:1, who was delighted by Solomon's wisdom, who blessed the God of Israel when he heard Solomon's plans for the temple. This positive portrayal reflects the reality that the Phoenician cities and the Israelite kingdoms were, for much of their coexistence, more commercial partners and cultural exchanges than enemies. The darker portrayal of the Phoenicians in the biblical text centers on the figure of Jezebel, the Phoenician princess from Sidon who married the Israelite king Ahab and whose name has become, in the English language, a byword for wickedness. The biblical account of Jezebel, concentrated in the books of Kings, depicts her as the primary agent of the Baal worship that the biblical authors present as the great religious corruption of the northern Israelite kingdom. She imported Phoenician religious practices, supported Phoenician religious personnel, and actively persecuted the prophets who opposed her. The conflict between Elijah the prophet and the prophets of Baal, culminating in the dramatic confrontation on Mount Carmel, is, in the biblical narrative, fundamentally a conflict between Israelite and Phoenician religious traditions, mediated through the figure of a Phoenician queen on an Israelite throne. The prophetic tradition's hostility to Phoenician religious practices, to Baal worship, to Astarte veneration, to the specific practices associated with Phoenician religion runs through much of the Hebrew prophetic literature. The prophet Ezekiel's extended lament for Tyre, which we noted earlier as a remarkable description of Phoenician commerce, is simultaneously a prophecy of Tyre's destruction. The commercial magnificence of the city is presented as the sign of its pride, and its pride as the cause of its coming fall. This ambivalence, the recognition of Phoenician achievement and the condemnation of Phoenician religion, is the characteristic biblical stance toward the Phoenicians. They are neighbors, trading partners, cultural influences, and religious threats simultaneously. The entanglement of Phoenician and Israelite history is one of the most complex and fascinating relationships in the ancient Near East. It was not a simple opposition of good and evil, of piety and corruption. It was the relationship of adjacent cultures in continuous contact, influencing each other in ways that neither fully acknowledged. The history of the Phoenician cities in the 6th through 4th centuries BCE was lived in the shadow of two successive empires, first Persia, then Macedonia, and the story of how the Phoenicians navigated this shadow is one of pragmatic survival and occasional dramatic resistance. The Persian Empire conquered the Phoenician cities in the 540s BCE during the campaigns of Cyrus the Great and his successors. The Phoenician cities did not resist the Persian conquest in the way that Tyre had resisted the Assyrians and Babylonians. They submitted, and in submitting, they found an accommodation with Persian power that actually served their commercial interests reasonably well. The Persians needed Phoenician ships and Phoenician sailors. The Persian Empire had no significant naval tradition of its own. Its power was fundamentally continental, built on cavalry and infantry. When the Persians decided to project power across the sea, against the Greek cities of the Aegean, against the islands of the eastern Mediterranean, eventually, in the great invasion of Greece that Xerxes launched in 480 BCE, they needed Phoenician naval expertise. The Phoenician cities provided ships and crews for the Persian fleets. At the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, the famous naval battle in which the Greek fleet defeated the Persian fleet and effectively ended Xerxes' invasion of Greece, Phoenician warships formed the largest and most capable component of the Persian naval force. The Phoenicians lost at Salamis, fighting for a cause that was not their own, against sailors who had every motivation to fight to the last man. The Greek historian Herodotus records that Xerxes, watching the battle from a throne on the hillside, was particularly angered by the performance of the Phoenician contingent and executed some Phoenician captains who came to him with excuses for their fleet's poor showing. This was not the Phoenicians' war, it was the Persians' war, and the Phoenicians were fighting it because they had no choice. The relationship between the Phoenician cities and the Persian Empire was, for the most part, one of mutually beneficial accommodation. The Persians valued Phoenician naval capabilities and commercial networks. The Phoenicians valued the security that Persian power provided and the access to eastern markets that Persian rule facilitated, but the relationship had its limits. In 351 BCE, the city of Sidon, under its king Tennis, led a revolt against Persian authority. The causes of the revolt are not entirely clear from the available sources, but they appear to have included heavy Persian taxation and specific military demands that Sidon found unacceptable. The revolt briefly succeeded. Sidon expelled the Persian garrison and burned the fodder stored for the Persian cavalry. But the Persian response, when it came, was overwhelming. Artaxerxes III marched west with an enormous army, and Sidon, the great commercial city, the second of the Phoenician cities, made a decision that has haunted its memory ever since. Rather than submit to Persian siege and the destruction that would follow, rather than fight and face the inevitable defeat, the people of Sidon locked their gates, gathered inside, and set fire to their own city. 40,000 people died in the flames of Sidon, burned, according to the ancient sources, by their own hands rather than face Persian captivity. The king Tennis, who had negotiated secretly with the Persians in hope of personal survival, was executed anyway. It was the most dramatic act of collective resistance in the history of the Phoenician cities, and it was also effectively the beginning of the end of Phoenician political independence. In 332 BCE, one of the most remarkable military operations in the history of ancient warfare unfolded on the coast of what is now Lebanon. Alexander the Great, so the young Macedonian king who had already conquered Persia, who was marching toward Egypt and then toward the further east, arrived before the walls of Tyre. Tyre refused to submit. The city on its island, half a kilometer from the shore, protected by walls rising 45 meters above sea level, stocked with supplies for a long siege, backed by a fleet of ships that could harass any besieging force, felt, reasonably enough, that it could hold out. It had held out against Assyrian and Babylonian sieges. It could hold out against a Macedonian king, however brilliant. Alexander did something no one had ever done before. He built a causeway. Across the half-kilometer of water between the mainland shore and the island, Alexander set his engineers and his army to work building a mole, a raised road of earth and timber and stone driven from the shore toward the island, extending across the sea. It was an engineering project of audacity bordering on madness. The Tyrians attacked the construction constantly, with fire ships, with archers, with whatever weapons they could bring to bear. Alexander had to build towers on the end of the mole to provide covering fire for the workers. He had to assemble a fleet to protect the mole's flanks. He had to maintain the morale of an army engaged in construction work, the unglamorous drudgery of moving earth and stone, while under constant attack. It took 7 months, but at the end of 7 months, Alexander's mole reached the island. The walls of Tyre were breached by siege engines brought up along the causeway. The Macedonian army poured in. The city, which had resisted for 7 months, fell in a day. The Phoenician trading records describe what followed with terrible specificity. Approximately 2,000 Tyrian men of military age were crucified along the shore. Approximately 30,000 people were sold into slavery. The city was burned. Tyre, the greatest of the Phoenician cities, the city that had defied the Assyrians for decades and Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years, was destroyed in a day once the sea barrier that had protected it for centuries was bridged. The causeway that Alexander built, the mole that connected the island to the mainland, was never entirely removed. The sea filled in around it, and the silt accumulated, and over the centuries the island of Tyre became a peninsula. Modern Sur in Lebanon stands on that peninsula today. Alexander's causeway, buried under centuries of sediment, but still there as the geological foundation of the land connection, is the physical legacy of the 7-month siege that ended the independence of the greatest Phoenician city. The fall of Tyre to Alexander did not immediately end Phoenician culture. The cities continued to exist, rebuilt under Macedonian and then Roman authority. The Phoenician language continued to be spoken for several more centuries, gradually giving way to Aramaic and then Greek as the languages of commerce and administration. Phoenician culture persisted in its colonies, most notably in Carthage, which would endure for another 2 centuries after Alexander's death, before its own destruction at Roman hands in 146 BCE. But the political independence of the Phoenician cities, the capacity to be their own masters, to pursue their own commercial strategies without the permission of a larger power, effectively ended with Alexander. The era of the Phoenicians as an independent force in the ancient world was over. What they had built, the alphabet, the commercial networks, the glass-blowing tradition, the maritime knowledge, the dye industry, these things did not end with their political independence. They continued, they spread, they transformed. The Phoenicians disappeared as a distinct political entity. Their gifts to humanity did not disappear. They became the world. Stand anywhere in the modern world and look around you. The words on the signs are written in an alphabet that descends from Phoenician. The glass in the windows around you is the product of a tradition of glass making that the Phoenicians developed and spread. The purple of a royal robe or a bishop's vestment carries the memory of a color that Phoenician dyers extracted from sea snails 3,000 years ago. The commercial networks that connect the products of one part of the world to the markets of another are the descendants, in principle, if not in direct institutional lineage, of the Phoenician commercial philosophy that valued trade over conquest. The Phoenician legacy is everywhere. It is simply not labeled. The most important reason for this invisibility is the nature of what the Phoenicians left behind. Empires leave monuments, the pyramids of Egypt, the Colosseum of Rome, the Great Wall of China. These physical structures survive and announce themselves, demanding recognition impossible to ignore. The Phoenicians left tools, the alphabet, the ships, the commercial techniques, the glassmaking tradition. Tools do not announce themselves, they are simply used. The person writing a letter in an alphabetic script does not think about Phoenician merchants. The person drinking from a glass vessel does not think about Sidonian glassblowers. The tool becomes invisible through its very success. The more universally a tool is adopted, the more natural it seems, the more it appears to be simply part of the order of things rather than a specific invention with a specific history. The alphabet is so universal, used by so many people in so many languages for so many purposes, that it has become, for most of its users, simply the way writing works. The fact that it was invented at a specific time, by specific people, in a specific place, that it is not the natural order of things but a cultural achievement of the first order, is something that requires active effort to remember. The genetic legacy of the Phoenicians is more tangible than their cultural legacy in some respects because it can be measured. Ancient DNA studies have analyzed the genetic material of individuals buried at Phoenician sites across the Mediterranean, at Sidon, at Carthage, at other colonial sites, and compared it with the genetic profiles of modern populations. The results are striking. In Lebanon is the heartland of ancient Phoenicia. A significant proportion of the modern population shows genetic continuity with the ancient Phoenician populations. The Lebanese people of today are, in a measurable biological sense, the descendants of the Phoenicians. In Malta, the small island republic in the central Mediterranean that was a Phoenician trading station for centuries, a distinctive genetic signature traces back to the ancient Phoenician settlers. The Maltese language, though it later became heavily influenced by Arabic, retains Semitic structures that reflect its Phoenician and Punic roots. In Tunisia, the site of ancient Carthage, genetic traces of the Carthaginian population persist in the modern population alongside the signatures of later Arab and Berber migrations. The Phoenicians did not simply spread their culture across the Mediterranean, they spread their genes, the physical descendants of the people who invented the alphabet, who discovered the utility of the North Star for navigation, who developed glass blowing and purple dye. They are still there, still living on the shores and islands that their ancestors settled. The recovery of Phoenician history from the obscurity into which it fell after the destruction of Carthage and the absorption of the Levantine cities into the Roman world has been the work of several centuries of scholarship. The process has been uneven and still incomplete. The first systematic modern attention to the Phoenicians came in the 18th and 19th centuries as European scholars began to engage seriously with the ancient Near East, reading the classical texts that mentioned the Phoenicians, examining the inscriptions in Phoenician script that had begun to be collected, attempting to reconstruct from fragmentary evidence the history of a people who had left relatively few written records of their own. The excavation of Byblos, begun by the French archaeologist Ernest Renan in the 1860s and developed through the extensive campaigns of Pierre Montet in the 1920s and Maurice Dunant in subsequent decades, produced an archaeological record of the city's 7,000 years of occupation that is still being analysed and interpreted. The excavation of the Tophet at Carthage, the deposit of cremated remains that has generated such extensive debate, was conducted by various teams from the late 19th century onward, with the most rigorous modern work being done by Franco-Tunisian and American-Tunisian teams in recent decades. At Sidon, excavations that have intensified in the 21st century, particularly following construction projects that exposed ancient layers, have produced remarkable finds, including intact glass vessels, inscriptions, and the remains of the purple dye industry that made the city famous. Underwater archaeology has contributed important discoveries. Phoenician shipwrecks recovered from the Mediterranean seafloor have provided information about hull construction, cargo arrangements, and the material culture of Phoenician maritime commerce that no land excavation could supply. The most dramatic underwater discoveries are the two Phoenician-era shipwrecks found by archaeologist Robert Ballard, the explorer who also discovered the Titanic, at a depth of approximately 450 meters in the Mediterranean. These wrecks, dating to approximately the 8th century BCE, still contain their cargo of amphorae, remarkably preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor conditions of the deep sea floor. The decipherment of the Phoenician language, accomplished by European scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries, opened the inscriptional record of the civilization to analysis. Phoenician is a Semitic language, closely related to Hebrew and to the other Semitic languages of the ancient Near East. Scholars who knew Hebrew could read Phoenician inscriptions with relatively modest additional study. The inscriptional record of Phoenicia is not as rich as that of Egypt or Mesopotamia. The Phoenicians did not produce the epic literature, the religious hymns, the administrative archives that the great river plain civilizations preserved in their thousands of clay tablets. What survives are primarily shorter texts, dedicatory inscriptions on objects offered to temples, tomb inscriptions recording names and genealogies, commercial records on perishable materials that have mostly not survived. The recovery of Phoenician literary tradition if such a tradition existed in the forms we recognize as literature, has not been accomplished. The texts that ancient sources attributed to Phoenician authors, philosophical and religious works that were apparently known in the ancient world, have not survived. Either they were not preserved or they were lost in the destruction of the libraries of the Phoenician cities. What survives is enough to reconstruct the broad outlines of Phoenician history and culture. What is lost is the inner life, the specific beliefs, the stories, the poetry, the arguments that the Phoenicians had among themselves about who they were and what mattered. This silence is one of the characteristic frustrations of Phoenician studies. We know what the Phoenicians did, we know far less about what they thought. The question of Phoenician identity in the modern world is not merely academic. It has been, for much of the 20th century, a genuinely contested political and cultural question in Lebanon. Lebanese nationalism, the ideology that defined Lebanon as a distinct nation with its own history and identity, separate from the broader Arab world, drew heavily on the Phoenician heritage. The claim that the Lebanese people were primarily the descendants of the ancient Phoenicians rather than primarily Arabs was used to argue for a distinct Lebanese identity that did not require absorption into the larger Arab nation that Arab nationalist movements of the 20th century were trying to build. This Phoenicianism was particularly associated with certain Christian communities in Lebanon, the Maronites especially, who found in the Phoenician heritage a lineage that differentiated them from the Arab Muslim majority of the broader region and connected them to the cosmopolitan, commercially sophisticated, seafaring civilization of the ancient world. The politics of Lebanese Phoenicianism are complex and contested, and this is not the place for a detailed engagement with them. But the underlying historical question, the relationship between the modern Lebanese population and the ancient Phoenician civilization, is genuine and has been illuminated by the genetic studies mentioned earlier. The modern Lebanese population does show significant genetic continuity with the ancient populations of the Levantine coast. The people of Lebanon are, in a real biological sense, connected to the Phoenicians. The connection is not exclusive. Lebanon's history has involved many migrations, conquests, and population movements since the Phoenician period. But it is real. The cedars of Lebanon, the same trees that the Phoenicians traded to Egypt and Mesopotamia, and that Solomon used in the temple, still stand in scattered remnants in the mountains above the Lebanese coast. They are among the most ancient living trees in the Middle East. Some of the oldest individual trees in the Cedars of God reserve in the Qadisha Valley may be several thousand years old, trees that were saplings or already mature when Phoenician merchants were negotiating with Egyptian pharaohs. They are the living link between the ancient and the modern, the same species of tree, the same mountains, the same coast. The Phoenicians are not simply a matter of the distant past. In Lebanon, they are the foundation of identity, contested, debated, politically charged, but present. The story of the Phoenicians is, among other things, a story about what civilizational influence actually looks like. We are accustomed to associating influence with power, with empires that impose their language, their religion, their institutions on conquered peoples. The Romans spread Latin and Roman law and Roman infrastructure across Europe, not by persuading people of their value, but by conquering the people and then providing the infrastructure that made Roman culture impossible to avoid. The Phoenicians spread their alphabet, their commercial techniques, their artistic traditions, their religious ideas by a completely different mechanism, by being useful. The alphabet spread because it was useful, because anyone who learned it could write anything in their own language, could keep their own records, could communicate across distance, could preserve their own traditions. It was not imposed, it was adopted willingly by every people who encountered it and understood what it could do. The Phoenician commercial network spread because it served the interests of the people who participated in it, because Phoenician merchants brought goods that other people wanted and paid fair prices for the goods they received. The network was not built by conquest, it was built by repeated transactions in which both parties benefited enough to want to transact again. The Phoenicians were not morally pure, no ancient civilization was. They participated in the slave trade. Their religious practices included elements that their neighbors found horrifying. Their commercial success was built in part on monopolies enforced by secrecy and sometimes by violence. But their model of influence through genuine usefulness, through providing things that people actually wanted and needed, through creating value rather than simply extracting it, is worth contemplating in a world that has too often confused power with worth. The Phoenicians were small. They were never militarily dominant. They were repeatedly conquered, absorbed, destroyed, rebuilt. They had no great empire that commanded the resources of continents. And yet, the letters of the alphabet that carry the knowledge of humanity, the commercial networks that connect the products of one corner of the world to the needs of another, the glass technology that enabled the scientific revolution, the maritime knowledge that made the Mediterranean a connected world. These are Phoenician gifts, and they outlasted every empire that conquered the Phoenician cities. Power is temporary, usefulness is permanent. The Phoenicians knew this, not as a philosophical principle, but as the practical wisdom of a small people who could not afford to be powerful in the conventional sense, and who found, in the alternative, something more lasting. It is evening on the Lebanese coast. The sun is going down over the Mediterranean, the same sun that set over this coast when Phoenician merchants were loading their ships with cedar and purple cloth and glass vessels. The same light on the same water. The city of Sur, ancient Tyre, stands on its peninsula. The ruins of the Crusader city are visible near the shore. Beneath them, the Roman city. Beneath that, layers that the archaeologists have only partially explored, the Phoenician city that Alexander besieged for 7 months and destroyed in a day. The sea has covered the ancient harbour. Divers who explore the underwater ruins of Tyre report seeing column drums and cut stone on the seafloor. The remains of the buildings that the siege destroyed, the buildings that slid into the water over the centuries as the shore slowly changed. The alphabet that the Phoenician merchants invented is being used right now in hundreds of languages across the world. The glass in the windows of the houses above the ancient ruins is the descendant of techniques that Sidonian glassblowers developed 2,000 years ago. The cedar forests are mostly gone, cut down across the centuries, the great trees that once covered the Lebanon mountains reduced to scattered remnants in a few protected reserves. But the trees that remain are old enough to have stood when the forests were full, old enough to carry in their rings a record of the climate and the history of the centuries since. The sea is the same sea that carried Phoenician merchants to Cyprus and Sicily and Sardinia and Spain. The same sea that Hanno sailed beyond, rounding West Africa in his exploration. The same sea that Phoenician navigators crossed by the light of the pole star they were the first to use systematically. The sea does not remember, but we can. We can remember that the letters we write were invented by merchants on this coast, that the glass we drink from traces its lineage to craftsmen in these cities, that the commercial philosophy of mutual benefit rather than extraction was practiced here 3,000 years before Adam Smith wrote it down. We can remember that civilization is not always built by the largest or the most powerful, that the gifts that last longest are not always given by those who gave them most loudly. The Phoenicians were quiet, they were busy, they were sailing and trading and inventing and building and making the world useful rather than merely impressive. and the world they made is the world we still live in. Rest now. The Mediterranean is breathing. The same sea the Phoenician ships crossed. The same stars that navigated them home. The letters of this story, every one of them, a gift from the people of the Purple Coast, still here, still useful, still the foundation of the world we write. Good night.